Okay, motion blur. This is the one part of the tutorial where you literally won't find this information anywhere else. I know, I looked. I spent months researching the best method for motion blur, searching the far corners of the internet trying to understand it. In the end, I came up with my own method. Now, I didn't actually code the software that will allow you to do this, but at the time this guide gets released, this method is documented nowhere else. The quality on it is extremely good, it's scalable, and will work in any situation depending on your settings. That said, I should explain exactly what motion blur is. Here's an easy way to explain it. Hold your hand out in front of you and look at it. Now move it from side to side quickly. Do you see that blurry trail it leaves? That's motion blur. It has to do with how fast the cones and rods in your eyes can respond to looking at something that's moving. It's the biological equivalent of the response time on your computer monitor. Now the problem with this is that most computer games output the footage with no blur whatsoever. It would be like if you had a camera with a shutter speed of 0 milliseconds. Now the upside to this is that you'll get a perfectly clear picture in every single frame, but it also means that moving objects will look a little less natural. Now maybe you don't want motion blur in your footage. There's nothing that says you have to. But before you decide, let me show you a before and after comparison. I'm going to show the crash scene from Galaxy Gulp again. Both shots will be recorded in 30 frames per second. Pay attention to the samurai arms and the chips flying everywhere especially. Okay, that looked pretty good. This was recorded using the source recorder, so there were no drop frames. But now let's look at the same scene using motion blur. See how fluid and smooth that looks? Go and rewind it if you want to. You'd be surprised how much more natural some animations will look when processed with motion blur. Now you may be thinking, but Ross, the Orange Box games include motion blur in the engine. Why do we need to know this? Well, the answer is that the motion blur used in the Episode 2 engine only works in specific situations, like turning or accelerating. And it does not capture in the source recorder, and I haven't even been able to get it to capture reliably in fraps. The method I'll be teaching here works in all situations on any footage that has a high frame rate. It doesn't even have to be in the source engine. Now your next thought may be, well, I already know of a video editor that does motion blur. I don't need to learn this. My answer to this is go ahead and try. See how it compares against what I'll be showing you. There are very few programs that will do a good job of this. I know. I looked through all of this stuff. Some 3D modeling and rendering programs will output good motion blur, as will a plugin I've seen for the Quake 3 engine, but that doesn't help you for working at source. The only other method I've seen that does a satisfactory job in adding motion blur besides what I'm going to teach is a plugin for Adobe Premiere and After Effects called Real Smart Motion Blur. That's REEL. And even then, this plugin costs money, takes just as long to process the footage, and in my opinion doesn't do as good a job as what I'm going to show you. But back to what I was saying about other editors. The way most editors claim to do motion blur is by adding a transparency of the different frames on your footage. The more frames you have, the closer to actual motion blur this will resemble. However, you technically have to get an infinite number of frames to get a perfect blur this way. If you have a really fast scene, even several hundred frames per second might not cut it using this method. When you see a double image using this technique, this is what's known as ghosting. Here, I'll show you a sample of that right now. Here's the same clip showing ghosting at 30 frames per second. That looks like a bit of a mess, right? Well, it gets better the higher your recorded frame rate is, but it never looks quite as convincing as the method I'm going to show you at the same frame rate. The reason is because my method uses motion vectors, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So you can try another program and maybe get away with it if you're using a low resolution or have a relatively slow scene. But my method can handle any footage you throw at it and still do a great job. Now let me give you a warning before we get started. Motion blur processing is slow. I'm not joking. It's slow to record and it's slow to process. It's very CPU intensive, but it can make your final results look pretty slick. Alright, let's get started.